The first time an oil lamp was lit, the world must have seemed a little less lonely. In the quiet of some long-forgotten night, perhaps in a desert tent or a small coastal hut, someone leaned close to a shallow dish of oil, touched a flame to the wick, and saw the shadows move for the first time. The light was small. It did not roar like firewood or crackle like a campfire. It simply bloomed, a soft, steady glow, enough to push the darkness back a few paces. Enough to paint the walls in gold. Oil lamps were never meant to flood the world with light. They were gentle things, built for one person, one table, one room, and they carried with them a special magic, the shadows they cast. If you stand in a lamplit room, you will notice that the light is not perfect. It does not erase darkness, but reshapes it, bending it into long, slow-moving silhouettes. The flicker of the flame sends them gliding across the floor, dancing up the wall, or curling around corners you cannot see. In the ancient world, this shifting of light and shadow was not a mere decoration. It was the theater of the night. Walls became screens where shapes told silent stories. The curve of a clay pot might stretch into a towering arch. The folds of a robe might climb the wall like a slow wave. Children would watch these changes as if the room itself were alive. And perhaps, for those living thousands of years ago, it was alive. For them, shadows could carry messages, omens, even spirits. The movement of light on the wall could mean a change in weather, or the arrival of a guest, or the presence of something unseen. Sati. Oil lamp itself was a humble object, often no more than a small clay or bronze vessel shaped by a craftsman's hand, with a simple spout for the wick and a hollow for the oil. Yet it was more than just a tool. It was a companion. It burned slowly through the hours when the world outside was black and silent, and its light touched every moment, from reading and sewing to prayer and storytelling. Imagine an evening in a small Roman home. The streets outside are empty paved stones cooling after the heat of the day. Inside, a lamp sits on a wooden table. The oil is olive, pressed earlier in the season. The wick is linen, trimmed short. A mother sits near the table mending a tunic. The light makes her eyes bright and her fingers pale. Her child, half asleep, watches the dark shapes her hands cast on the wall. The lamp burns on, steady, silent, breathing warmth into the shadows. The beauty of an oil lamp's shadow was that it could never be fully predicted. A gust of air from an open window could send them swaying wildly. Passing figure could suddenly stretch across the wall like a giant. The flicker could make a familiar shape look like something entirely new. In temples and shrines, the effect was even more striking. Statues of gods and saints would seem to move. In the lamplight, an arm might shift, a face might seem to turn. The faithful would kneel and whisper, convinced that the divine had revealed itself, when in truth it was the simple dance of light on stone. For thousands of years, across cultures and continents, the oil lamp shaped the way people saw their nights. It did not just illuminate, it transformed. Every flame was a painter, every shadow was its brushstroke, and as the lamp burned lower, the shadows would grow longer and softer, until finally, the oil gone, the wick spent, they faded into the deep, unbroken dark. Before the world knew candles, before glass lanterns, before the hum of electric bulbs, there was oil. It was one of the first fuels humans learned to tame for light, quiet, steady, and patient. The oil lamp became a bridge between fire and darkness, and every culture built it in its own way. In ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of cities, lamps were simple clay bowls, sometimes nothing more than a shallow cup pinched on one side to hold a wick. The clay came from the banks of the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, shaped by hand, fired in small kilns, and kept close to the hearth. The oil was usually sesame, pressed from seeds grown in sunlit fields. When lit, the flame was soft and golden, casting wide, smooth shadows on mud brick walls. The merchants and scribes of Babylon might have worked late under such light, the flicker dancing over clay tablets as the stylus etched lines of cuneiform. Further west, in Egypt, the Nile's gifts shaped another kind of lamp. Here, olive oil was rarer. Instead, Egyptians used castor oil or even animal fat. Some lamps were carved from alabaster, their pale stone glowing faintly when lit, turning the whole vessel into a warm lantern. In temples, priests carried them during night rituals, the flicker glinting off gilded statues of gods. The shadows in these sacred spaces were alive, tall columns breathing with moving patterns, hieroglyphs rippling as if the walls themselves whispered. To the north, in the Greek world, oil lamps became more refined. Greek potters shaped them with lids to keep insects and dust from the oil. The surfaces were often decorated, tiny mythological scenes painted or carved into the clay. A lamp in Athens might show a winged horse or a running figure. When lit, the designs would blur under the moving glow, and the shadows would take over, crawling across the marbled rooms where philosophers debated. The Romans, inheriting much from the Greeks, spread the oil lamp across their empire. Roman lamps were often made from molds, mass-produced in terracotta so they could be sold in markets from Britannia to Egypt. Some were plain, others bore stamped images of gladiators, ships, or gods. The wealthy might use bronze or silver lamps, suspended from chains, their flames reflected in polished metal to double the light. In the villas of the rich, shadow and luxury intertwined. The flicker on mosaic floors, the shifting shapes on painted walls, the silhouettes of servants moving through the rooms. Far to the east, in China, oil lamps took on yet another form. Bronze craftsmen shaped them into animals and birds, their hollow bodies holding the oil, their beaks or mouths cradling the flame. Some even had clever chimneys to guide the smoke away. In these homes, the shadows were not random. They were part of the art. The lamp itself was a sculpture, and the movement of light brought it to life. A crane might appear to bow. A tiger might seem to breathe. Everywhere, no matter the material or shape, the lamp's gift was the same. It gave the night a softer edge. People could eat, write, pray, and speak without fear of complete darkness. And yet, the shadows were never banished. They lingered in the corners, on the ceilings, around the doorways. They reminded everyone that light was a guest in the house of night, and that it would not stay forever. When the oil was poured, it carried with it the memory of the day's labor, the press of the olive harvest, the slow turning of a millstone, the storage jars in cool cellars. Lighting a lamp was not just an act of utility. It was a connection to the fields, the farmers, and the sun that had ripened the fruit. For ancient people, shadows were not empty shapes. They were stories waiting to be told. The lamp was the narrator, the flame was the voice, and the walls were the pages. Each night, as long as the wick burned, the tale continued, silent, shifting, and endless. When darkness falls in a sacred place, the air changes. Every sound becomes sharper. Every footstep echoes a little longer. In such moments, the light of an oil lamp is more than light. It is presence. Temples across the ancient world used oil, lamps not only to see, but to speak to the unseen. The flame was a bridge between the human and the divine, a living symbol of prayer that could be touched but never held. And the shadows it cast, they were the messengers. In a small shrine in ancient Mesopotamia, the priests of Ishtar prepared for night offerings. The air was heavy with the scent of sesame oil and incense. A row of clay lamps sat on a low altar, their flames leaning gently in the stillness. Behind them, the stone face of the goddess seemed to shift as the light moved, her eyes deepening, her lips softening into a smile that no sculptor had carved. For the worshipper kneeling there, this was not an illusion. It was the goddess herself, alive in the flicker. In Egypt, the priests of Amun would walk the inner halls of the temple by lamplight. The stone walls, carved with rows of gods and kings, seemed to sway under the moving glow. Hieroglyphs, stiff in daylight, danced at night. The lamp flame licked at the gold leaf on statues, making them shimmer like they were breathing. To stand there, in that narrow corridor, was to feel time dissolve. You could almost believe the gods had stepped down from their pedestals. In Greece, the mysteries of Eleusis were whispered about, never written down. Some say that during the rites, initiates were led through dark passages, guided only by oil lamps. The shadows that darted along the walls were part of the vision, a silent chorus that carried secrets too great for words. In the glow, simple things could become symbols. The curve of an amphora, the outline of a hand, the shadow of a priest's robe billowing like a spirit. Rome, too, had its sacred lamplight. In the underground catacombs, early Christians lit small terracotta lamps to guide their steps and mark their prayers. The shadows stretched long in the low ceilings, bending over carved fish and anchors, symbols of faith hidden from the world above. Here the flame was quiet, private, unguarded. It was not the light of spectacle, but of survival. Far away in India, the lighting of a deepa, a small oil lamp, was and still is an offering in itself. Placed before an image of a deity, the lamp's glow becomes the face of devotion. When moved in slow circles, it sends shadows swaying over the figure, as though the god is wrapped in living light. The dance of flame and shadow is not just seen, it is felt in the chest, in the breath. Even in places where no gods were carved and no temples stood, people found the sacred in the lamplight. In a shepherd's tent under the desert sky, a single oil lamp could turn the rough fabric walls into a stage where the day's memories played. The flame was both hearth and guardian, keeping away the cold, the wild, and the emptiness beyond. Across centuries, the sacred night remained the same. Light was fleeting, darkness was endless, and the oil lamp stood between them, holding a space where the human heart could speak. When the rituals ended, the lamps were not blown out in haste. The flame was pinched gently, the wick laid down like a sleeping child. And, in the darkness that followed, the memory of the shadows lingered, a quiet afterimage on the walls of the mind. In the lands of ancient Greece and Rome, the moments before sunrise held a subtle but undeniable power. These were civilizations where the day's rhythm was deeply intertwined with the movements of the sun, the phases of the moon, and the will of the gods. Yet here, the pre-dawn hour was not merely for sleep's final moments. It was a time when devotion, preparation, and superstition converged. The philosopher's hour in Athens, when the streets still lay in shadow and the marble columns of the agora were only faintly visible, certain minds were already awake. Philosophers, scholars, and orators often valued the pre-dawn hour for its silence. Without the bustle of merchants or the distractions of the city, thoughts could be gathered like clear water from a still spring. Plato was said to rise before the first light, sometimes walking alone to the academy, letting the cool air sharpen his senses. Others, like the Stoics, considered this time ideal for prososche, attentive reflection, asking themselves what virtues they would embody in the coming day. Candles or oil lamps flickered on desks as wax tablets were filled with notes, ideas, and questions to be discussed later when the city awoke. In these quiet hours, entire philosophies took shape. Household devotions in Greece. For ordinary Athenians, life before sunrise often began with small acts of piety. In many homes, a simple shrine stood in the courtyard, dedicated to Hestia, goddess of the hearth. Before the day's work began, the hearth fire was tended, coals stirred, and sometimes a few drops of wine or oil were offered. Bread, fruit, or incense might be placed beside the flame, a request for the goddess to bless the home and protect the family. These offerings were done in near silence, the city around them still asleep. Even in the humblest homes, the belief was the same. If the household began the day in harmony with the gods, the rest would follow more smoothly. Pre-dawn in the temples, the great temples, to Athena in Athens, Apollo in Delphi, or Artemis in Ephesus, were places of both grandeur and deep stillness before sunrise. Priests and priestesses often rose well before light to perform cleansing rites. Water from sacred springs was poured over hands and faces, and white linen. Robes were donned. Altars were prepared for the first offerings of the day. In Delphi, the oracle of Apollo would not speak until after sunrise, but her attendants prepared long before. They burned laurel leaves, swept the temple floors, and whispered prayers in the dark, believing that the purity of the early hour helped open the way for divine presence. The Roman dawn in Rome, the city that never seemed to rest pre-dawn, was nevertheless a moment of transformation. The streets might still be lit by torches, but bakeries were already glowing with fire as loaves were prepared for the day's trade. For the devout, the hour before sunrise was a time for the salutatio, the morning greeting of the household gods, the lares and penates. Offerings of bread, salt, and wine were placed before their small statues. The head of the household would sometimes pour a libation while murmuring a prayer not just for health and safety, but for the prosperity of the day's work. Military. Discipline. Before the light, the Roman legions knew no luxury of slow mornings. Soldiers were trained to rise before first light, sometimes even in the dead of night, to be ready for inspection or movement. In military camps, horns or trumpets would sound in the darkness. Armor was strapped on, weapons checked, and the first formations were made in near silence. Even here there was ritual. Many soldiers made the sign to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, or touched charms hanging from their necks, believing that protection began before the sun could see them. In both Greece and Rome, armies often began marches before sunrise, seeking the advantage of cool air and surprise. For these men, the hour before light was not one of quiet meditation, but of sharpened focus. Sailors and the pre-dawn tide. In the port cities, Piraeus, Ostia, Corinth, sailors had their own connection to the hour before sunrise. The sea was calmer before the wind picked up, and tides often favored early departure. Crews would gather in the dark, untying ropes, checking sails, and offering small tokens to Poseidon or Neptune. A cup of wine poured into the water, a wreath tossed into the waves, gestures to ensure safe passage. Superstition ran deep here. Some sailors refused to speak certain words before sunrise, fearing bad luck. Others believed that if the first person they saw was a priest or a child, the voyage would be blessed. Festivals that began before dawn, several Greek and Roman festivals began in the darkness, their rituals tied to the first appearance of the sun. The festival of Thesmophoria, dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, often required women to gather before sunrise, carrying sacred objects to hilltops or temples. In Rome, the festival of Aurora, goddess of the dawn, saw early offerings of flowers and incense as the sky began to lighten. These moments were more than ceremony. They were symbolic unions of human action with the turning of the heavens. The hour between worlds. In both Greece and Rome, poets sometimes wrote of the pre-dawn hour as a liminal time, when the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of the gods was thin. Homer's epics often describe heroes rising when the stars were still bright, beginning their journeys in the cool half-light of early morning. For farmers, sailors, soldiers, philosophers, and priests alike, there was an understanding, spoken or unspoken, that what one did in the darkness before dawn shaped not just the day, but the favor of the gods, from shadow to light. When the first rays of sunlight finally touched the marble temples, the tiled rooftops, and the bronze statues, it was as though the city inhaled all at once. Markets opened, voices rose, and the machinery of civilization began to turn. But those who had risen earlier carried something different into the day, a sense of alignment, whether with divine will, personal discipline, or the practical demands of survival. In this way, the pre-dawn hour in Greece and Rome was more than the start of the day. It was the foundation upon which the day's triumphs and trials were built. In our next part, we will cross the seas to the lands of North America's indigenous peoples, where the time before sunrise held a sacred place in storytelling. Hunting, traditions, and seasonal ceremonies, each tied deeply to the rhythms of the natural world. In the lands that would one day be called North America, the hours before sunrise were among the most sacred. Long before towns and roads were carved into the landscape, before clock towers measured the day, communities lived by the steady turning of the stars, the shifting moon, and the dependable rise of the sun. Here, the pre-dawn was not merely a stretch of darkness between sleeping and waking. It was a time when the world itself seemed to breathe differently, when the voices of the land and the spirits could be heard most clearly. The silence of the first breath. Many indigenous nations held that the hour before sunrise was a thin time, when the boundary between the physical world and the spirit world grew softer. Among the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota peoples, it was said that the first breath of the earth each day could be felt just before the sun appeared. The air was cooler, the grass damp with dew, and the animals still, as though all creation paused in anticipation. Those who rose to greet this hour often stood facing the east, offering silent prayers, tobacco, or cornmeal. It was not always a formal ceremony. Sometimes it was simply a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement that the day was a gift. The morning songs. In many communities, the day began with song. Among the Diné, Navajo, for example, there are traditional morning chants meant to align the singer with beauty, harmony, and balance, what is called hozo. These chants are best sung before sunrise, as the first light touches the horizon. The voice, rising in the cool darkness, was believed to carry farther, unhindered by the wind or the noise of the day. The sound might be accompanied by a hand, drum, or rattle, but often it was sung unaccompanied, the rhythm coming from the singer's breath. In these moments, the song was not performance, it was communion. Pre-dawn. Hunting rituals for hunters. The time before sunrise was both practical and spiritual. Deer, elk, and other game were most active in the cool hours before dawn. But hunting was not begun without ceremony. Among the Anishinaabe, hunters might rise in darkness, smudge themselves with the smoke of sage or sweetgrass to purify their spirit, and offer a prayer for the life they might take. They asked for success, but also for guidance to act with respect, taking only what was needed. Some hunters carried small medicine bundles, given to them by elders, which they touched, to their foreheads before setting out. Others spoke words taught by their grandfathers, not to be repeated outside the hunt, that called for safety, skill, and balance. Seasonal ceremonies. Before sunrise. The turning of the seasons brought special sunrise rituals. In the Pueblo, communities of the Southwest, the winter solstice, the shortest day, was greeted with ceremonies before dawn, marking the return of the sun. Priests and dancers, prepared in darkness, painting their faces, donning regalia, and singing as the first sliver of light broke over the mesa. For the Hopi, the soil ceremony included the lighting of fires and prayers for the sun's renewed strength, ensuring the continuation of life in the coming year. In the far north, the Inuit marked seasonal changes with songs and drum dances that might begin in the dim hours before sunrise, though in the depths of winter, the sun might not rise for days. Here, the pre-dawn became symbolic rather than literal, the moment before light could last many hours, even weeks. The sweat lodge at first light in many plains and woodlands traditions, the sweat lodge was a place of renewal and prayer. Some ceremonies began in the deep hours of the night and ended just before sunrise, when participants stepped out into the cool air, steam rising from their skin, hearts and spirits cleansed. The first sight of dawn after such a ceremony was deeply meaningful, a physical reminder of rebirth, of moving from darkness into light. Guardians of the camp before sunrise, not everyone slept. In larger gatherings, night watchmen, often younger men training for leadership, kept the camp safe. They moved quietly between lodges or teepees, listening for the sounds of predators or strangers. As the east began to pale, they would sometimes rouse the firekeepers who tended the communal blaze. In many traditions, this central fire represented the life of the people, and it was never allowed to go out. The firekeepers, working in the shadows, would add fresh wood, blow gently on the coals, and sometimes offer a pinch of tobacco into the flames. By the time the first families emerged from their lodges, the fire was already crackling, a sign that the day had begun. Children and the first lessons, elders often told children that rising before the sun was a mark of discipline and respect. In some communities, it was said that those who slept past sunrise would miss the blessings of the day, that the morning's first light carried a kind of energy that could not be regained later. In warm months, children might be brought to the river or lake in the early morning to bathe, the cold water waking the body and sharpening the mind. These moments often became lessons. A grandfather pointing to the way mist rises from the water, explaining how it mirrors the way prayers rise to the Creator. A spiritual compass across these diverse nations and traditions the hours before. Sunrise held one common truth. They were a compass for living in harmony. Whether it was through song, prayer, hunting, or tending the fire, each action was a way of setting one's direction before the demands of the day arrived. The pre-dawn was a time to acknowledge the gifts of the earth, the animals, the plants, the rivers, the wind, and to remember that human life was only one part of a much larger circle. The first light on the horizon, as the first light touched the edges of the land, pinks, golds, and pale blues, the camp would slowly stir. Cooking. Fires were lit, smoke curling into the sky. Children's voices began to break the silence. For those who had risen early, this was not the start of the day, but its continuation. They had already prayed, sung, worked, or listened to the world in its quietest state. In this way, the pre-dawn hour was both a personal and communal act, a shared understanding that the light was not something to wait for, but something to meet halfway. In our next part, we will cross the Atlantic to Africa, exploring the diverse pre-dawn traditions of nomadic tribes, river civilizations, and kingdoms that greeted the day with their own blend of practicality and reverence. In Africa, a land vast and varied, the hours before sunrise carried different meanings depending on where you stood. In the golden deserts of the north, in the green belts of the equator, and in the savannas stretching to the horizon, the time. Before first light was shaped by climate, livelihood, and faith. But in all these places, one truth held. The darkness before dawn was never empty. Nomads of the desert night, in the Sahara, the largest hot desert in the world, the Tuareg and Bedouin peoples learned long ago that the cool hours before sunrise were the best for travel. The heat of the day could kill a man unprepared, but in the dark hours the air was gentle, and the sand, though still warm from the day before, did not burn the feet of camels. Before setting out, the men would gather around the low glow of a fire, drinking tea in small, deliberate sips. This tea, bitter and hot, was brewed slowly, poured from high above the cup to create foam, a ritual of both hospitality and patience. Elders often began these journeys with a short prayer, facing east toward the direction of Mecca if they were Muslim, or toward the rising sun itself in older traditions. The stars overhead served as both compass and silent companion, and by the time the first blush of light touched the dunes, the caravan was already far from camp. The rivers whisper far from the deserts, along the slow, winding curves of the Nile. The first light meant work, but also blessing. In villages of Egypt and Sudan, farmers often woke before dawn to tend their fields in the cool air. But before the tools were lifted, some would kneel by the river, letting the water run over their hands, washing away the night. In ancient Egypt, the pre-dawn hours were dedicated to Ra, the sun god, whose journey through the underworld ended each morning in victory over darkness. Priests in the great temples would rise long before sunrise, bathing in sacred water, donning linen robes, and reciting hymns as they waited for the first shaft of sunlight to strike the temple walls. For them, this moment was more than the start of the day. It was the renewal of the world itself. Even thousands of years later, echoes of this rhythm remain along the Nile. Fishermen still push their boats into the river while the stars are out, believing the early catch is the best. And women still gather at the water's edge before sunrise, their quiet chatter mixing with the gentle splash of buckets filling. The drums before day in parts of West Africa, among the Yoruba, the Akan, and many others, music was woven into the fabric of daily life. And in some villages, the drum could be heard before dawn, not as a call to dance, but as a call to gather. These early morning rhythms might signal the start of a market day, the approach of a ceremony, or the arrival of news from a neighboring village. In sacred contexts, drums were used to speak to spirits or ancestors before the sun appeared, when it was believed the veil between worlds was thinner. In some traditions, women carried out special chants during this hour, calling on the Orishas, deities in Yoruba belief, for protection, prosperity, and safe journeys. The low hum of their voices mingled with the faint beating of drums, creating a soundscape that felt as old as the land itself. Herders of the high plains, in the savannas and grasslands of East Africa, the Maasai rose before dawn to tend their cattle. For these pastoral people, cattle were life, providing milk, meat, and wealth. The animals, too, stirred early, and before the sun appeared, the young men, or moran, would guide the herds toward fresh grazing grounds. Before leaving, elders sometimes sprinkled milk or water in front of the herd as an offering to Enkai, the Maasai god, asking for health and protection. The sight of dark silhouettes moving against the faintly glowing horizon, cattle lowing, spears glinting, was a daily reminder that life here was a balance between human skill, divine favor, and the gifts of the land. Night to light in. The forests in the dense rainforests of Central Africa, the Baaka and Mbuti peoples lived by hunting, foraging, and deep knowledge of the forest. Their mornings began with soft, polyphonic songs, voices overlapping like the calls of birds, sung as they prepared nets, baskets, or spears. The pre-dawn stillness of the forest was not truly still. Insects clicked and chirped, monkeys called in the distance, and somewhere, unseen, water dripped from the leaves. But the people's songs were an offering to the forest itself, a way of saying, "We are here, and we are grateful." In these communities, there was no clear division between sacred and ordinary life. To wake early, to sing before sunrise, to step barefoot into the mist, these were not separate from worship. They were worship. Pre-dawn rituals of power in. Ancient African kingdoms, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, kings and chiefs sometimes held private ceremonies before the day's duties began. In the royal compounds, advisors and spiritual leaders might gather in the dim light to offer counsel, interpret omens, or present offerings to ancestors. These rituals were often hidden from the public eye. A ruler's power was not only political, it was spiritual, tied to the blessings of those who came before. Beginning the day in harmony with the ancestors was believed to guard against misfortune and guide wise decisions. The moment of first. Light across Africa, whether in a crowded fishing village or an isolated desert camp, the first light brought both relief and renewal. It was the moment when the dangers of the night, predators, thieves, unseen spirits began to fade, and the visible world returned. Fires burned lower, tea kettles hissed, animals stretched and called, and people stepped from shadow into color. Yet for those who had been awake all along, the herders, the drummers, the fishers, the priests, the sunrise was not the start of the day, but the fulfillment of it. They had already spoken their prayers, sung their songs, and met the new day halfway, as their ancestors had done for generations. In the next part, we'll travel into the Islamic Golden Age, when scholars, merchants, and mystics shaped their mornings in ways that blended science, faith, and cultural beauty. The Islamic Golden Age, roughly from the 8th to the 14th century, was a time when the Muslim world stretched from Spain in the west to the borders of China in the east, connecting cultures, ideas, and trade routes in ways the world had never seen before. It was an age of scholars and poets, merchants and mystics, where faith and reason often walked hand in hand. And in this world, the hours before sunrise were more than a quiet prelude to the day. They were a sacred, deliberate space for both spiritual devotion and intellectual preparation. The call in the darkness, in every city, from the crowded streets of Baghdad to the winding alleys of Cordoba, the first sound of the day was the voice of the muezzin. Long before the sun touched the rooftops, he climbed the narrow steps of a mosque's minaret and called out the adhan, the summons to prayer. "Prayer is better than sleep," came the words in the stillness of the early hour, drifting over houses, courtyards, and gardens. For many, this was the moment they stirred from their beds. Lamps were lit, water was drawn for wudu, the ritual washing, and the faithful moved toward the mosque. In that hour, the city was alive, but softly so. Merchants still slept. Markets were silent. The only footsteps were those heading toward the mosque, robes brushing against cobblestones. Fajr and the scholars' discipline. The Fajr prayer performed before sunrise was not only an act of worship, but, for many scholars, the beginning of their intellectual work. In cities like Damascus, Nishapur, and Cairo, great libraries and madrasas stood near the mosques. After Fajr, some scholars would remain in quiet corners, reciting the Quran, while others unrolled parchment and began copying texts by lamplight. This was a world where time itself was treated as a trust, a gift from God not to be wasted. The early morning hours were prized for study, when the mind was fresh and distractions few. Ibn al-Haytham might have risen early to work on optics. Al-Khwarizmi could have prepared his calculations. Physicians like Al-Razi could review medical notes before visiting patients. The discipline of combining prayer with scholarship gave the mornings a rhythm that blended the sacred with the scientific. Merchants at first light in the great trading. Hubs, Cairo, Baghdad, Samarkand, merchants often began their work before the official market opened. The cool hours were ideal for preparing goods, checking caravans, and setting aside wares for special clients. But even commerce began with blessing. Many merchants recited verses asking for honesty in trade and protection from loss. In Islamic teaching, there was virtue in beginning work early, a baraka, or blessing, that came with the morning. This belief wasn't abstract. Traders swore that deals made before sunrise often brought the best fortune. Sufi mystics and the hidden hours in Sufi lodges, quiet sanctuaries tucked into city corners or hidden in the countryside. The pre-dawn hours were devoted to dhikr, the remembrance of God. The mystics gathered in circles, their voices low, repeating sacred phrases in unison. Some sat in silent meditation, breathing slowly, feeling the nearness of the divine in the hush before dawn. For them, the darkness was not empty but full of the presence of the one who created it. The faint light of oil lamps illuminated, faces worn by fasting, travel, and prayer. Outside, the world still slept, unaware of the spiritual storms and awakenings unfolding in these hidden rooms. Travelers on the road caravans that carried silk, spices, and books across deserts and mountains often began moving before sunrise. Muslim travelers kept a careful rhythm to their day, rise in the darkness, pray Fajr, then set out while the air was cool. Traveling in the Islamic world meant passing through landscapes dotted with mosques and caravanserais, roadside inns that welcomed merchants, pilgrims, and wanderers. Before dawn, the courtyard of a caravanserai was alive with movement, camels being loaded, tea boiling in iron pots, and the muffled talk of traders from distant lands. Astronomy. Before the light. The Muslim world of this era produced some of the greatest astronomers of history, al-Battani, al-Sufi, and later, Ulugh Beg. For them, the hours before sunrise were perfect for observation. The stars were still bright, the air often clearer, and the slow approach of dawn allowed them to record the precise moment the sun broke the horizon. These measurements weren't just academic, they were used to determine prayer times, the direction of Mecca, and the dates of important events. In observatories, high above the noise of the streets, scholars would stand with their instruments, wrapped in cloaks against the chill, watching the sky change color. The fragrance of morning in many Muslim cities, early morning had a scent. Bakers began their work before sunrise, kneading dough for flatbreads and pastries. The smell of baking bread drifted into the streets, mingling with the sharper scent of roasting coffee beans in later centuries. In the homes of the wealthy, servants might burn incense in the courtyards before the family awoke, believing it purified the air and the spirit. The combination of prayer, food, and fragrance made the morning not only a time for the mind and soul, but also for the senses. The meeting of worlds. What made the Islamic Golden Age remarkable was how the pre-dawn hours united so many different walks of life. The call to prayer touched the ruler in his palace, the scholar in his study, the farmer in his field, and the merchant in his stall. Each would shape those hours according to their role, but all shared the same frame. Faith at the center, followed by the work of the day. In this way, the darkness before dawn was not merely a personal moment. It was a shared experience across an empire. From the western edge of Al-Andalus to the eastern cities of Central Asia, countless lives moved in quiet synchronization, guided by the same stars, the same prayers, and the same first light. In the next part, we'll step into medieval Europe, where pre-dawn hours echoed with the chants of monks, the creak of watchmen's boots, and the whispered prayers of a world caught between faith and survival. The centuries we now call the Middle Ages, roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, were, in many ways, defined by cycles of light and darkness. In a Europe without electric lamps and only the faint flickering glow of torches or oil lamps, night was deep and absolute. For most, the hours before dawn were not merely the beginning of a day. They were a fragile border between the world of sleep and the labor of survival. In towns, villages, and monasteries, people moved through these hours with habits shaped by faith, fear, and necessity. The watchman and the sleeping city, in the narrow, winding streets of a medieval town, the silence before dawn was guarded by watchmen. These were men who patrolled the walls and gates, listening for the faintest sound of trouble, the crackle of fire, the approach of strangers, or the howl of wolves beyond the palisade. Their boots echoed on cobblestones. A lantern in hand, a halberd or spear over the shoulder, they would call the hour to each other. A tradition meant to reassure the townsfolk and remind them that they were not entirely alone in the night. Sometimes the watchman's call was the first sound a villager heard upon waking. It meant the night had been quiet and the world was still intact. Monks and the divine office. While townsfolk slept, the monasteries were already stirring. The life of a medieval monk was ruled by the divine office, a strict schedule of prayers at fixed hours. One of these matins often began deep in the night, sometimes around 2 or 3 in the morning. The monks rose from their straw mattresses in the dormitory, pulled on heavy robes, and walked in silence to the darkened chapel. Candles flickered in iron holders. The air was cold, sometimes frosted in winter. The chanting began slowly, psalms, hymns, and scripture echoing off stone walls. For the monks, these hours before dawn were not an interruption, but the spiritual center of their day. By the time the first faint light crept into the east, they had already prayed for hours. Farmers and the first tasks. Outside the towns, in the countryside, peasants and farmers often woke before sunrise out of necessity. The pre-dawn hours were precious. The air was cool, and the day's work could be started before the heat or the demands of livestock took over. A farmer might rise, tend to the fire, milk cows, or feed chickens before the sun appeared. If the season demanded, they might already be in the fields, planting by moonlight, harvesting grain before the dew dried, or bringing in hay before the weather turned. For many, there was no formal moment of beginning. Life flowed naturally, from night into labor. The rooster's crow was less a poetic signal than a practical alarm clock. The town baker and the glow of the oven in medieval towns, one of the earliest signs of life came from the baker's shop. Long before customers arrived, the baker and his apprentices were at work, kneading dough and tending the great wood-fired oven. From the bakery chimney rose a thin column of smoke into the cold air. The smell of baking bread drifted through empty streets, a silent promise of the day's first meal. Bakers often began their work around midnight, using the long hours to prepare enough loaves to feed the town. By the time the market bell rang, baskets of fresh bread would be ready for sale. Pilgrims and the road. Before sunrise, the Middle Ages were an age of pilgrimage. From the shrines of Canterbury to the far-off tomb of Santiago de Compostela, pilgrims crossed mountains and fields in search of spiritual blessing or penance. For them, starting the day before dawn was essential. Roads were safer in daylight, and the cool morning allowed for longer travel before fatigue set in. In the pre-dawn darkness, the road might be lit only by the moon and the glow of a pilgrim's lantern. Boots crunched on frozen earth or rustled through summer grass. And in the quiet, pilgrims prayed, sang hymns, or walked in silent reflection, guided by the hope of reaching holy ground. Superstitions of the early hours. In medieval belief, the time before dawn was not just quiet, it was dangerous. Many thought evil spirits roamed the night, growing bolder in the hours before sunrise. Some avoided going out before first light unless it was absolutely necessary. The church bells, ringing for morning prayers, were believed to drive away such spirits. Candles blessed on certain feast days were burned to keep the household safe, until dawn. For the deeply superstitious, even roosters were more than animals. Their crow was thought to mark the moment when darkness began to lose its power over the living. The market's first movements. While most townspeople still slept, the marketplace was waking. Farmers from nearby villages arrived with carts loaded with vegetables, eggs, and cheese. Traders rolled in from the countryside, hoping to claim the best spots before the square filled. The market before sunrise was a quieter place, a space for whispered deals, the exchange of gossip, and the first coins changing hands in the glow of lanterns. A Europe waiting for the light. In medieval Europe, the pre-dawn hours carried a sense of waiting. For the poor, it was waiting for the warmth of the sun to begin work in earnest. For monks, it was waiting for the next hour of prayer. For watchmen, it was waiting for the safety of daylight. The people of this age understood that light was more than a convenience. It was survival. The coming of dawn was not just beautiful, it was a daily reassurance that the darkness had passed once more. In the next part, we'll travel east to Japan and Korea, where before dawn rituals blended. Discipline, spirituality, and the rhythm of a society finely tuned to the rising sun. Long before the industrial age brought electric lights and mechanical clocks, the lands of Japan and Korea moved in rhythm with the sun and the seasons. In these cultures, the hours before dawn were not merely a transition into the working day. They were a sacred window where discipline, spirituality, and a deep respect for nature shaped the lives of those awake in the dark. The samurai and the discipline of first light. For the samurai of medieval Japan, the day began earlier than for most. Though the popular image of the samurai is tied to swordsmanship and battle, their lives were deeply rooted in discipline. And that discipline often started before sunrise. A samurai might rise in the quiet when the streets of the castle town were still wrapped in mist. They would tend to personal rituals, bathing in cold water to sharpen the senses, meditating in silence to prepare the mind, and practicing the forms of sword and bow long before the city stirred. The pre-dawn hours were a time to master the self, not just in martial skill, but in thought and conduct. In the stillness, a samurai could reflect on the Bushido code, the principles of loyalty, honor, and duty. In this way, the day began with an inner victory before any outward task was faced. The Shinto shrines and the purification of morning Shinto, Japan's indigenous spirituality, holds deep reverence for purity, both physical and spiritual. At shrines, priests often began their work before the first hint of light touched the horizon. One of the most important pre-dawn rituals was misogi, the act of purification. This could mean standing beneath a waterfall, washing in a river, or simply cleansing the hands and mouth at the shrine's water basin. The idea was to greet the new day with a cleansed body and an unburdened spirit. In some regions, entire communities would gather before dawn for seasonal festivals. They would walk in procession, carrying lanterns, up to a shrine on a hill or mountain, where the sunrise was awaited in reverent silence. The first rays of light were seen as a blessing from the kami, the divine spirits that inhabit the world. The fishermen and the tides, along the coasts of Japan and Korea, fishermen were among the first to rise. Their lives were tied to the sea's rhythms, and the hours before dawn often decided the day's success. In the fishing villages of Japan, boats would be pushed out under the stars, guided by lanterns swaying at the bow. The sound of oars and the smell of salt carried through the darkness. Nets were cast, not only in hope of a good catch, but as part of a tradition that had been passed down for centuries. Many fishing families also held small Shinto rituals before departure, offering rice, sake, or prayers to the sea gods for safety. For them, the pre-dawn hours were both practical and sacred, a moment when human effort met divine favor. Monks and the bell of morning in Buddhist temples across Japan and Korea, the day began well before the sun's first light. Monks rose at what was sometimes called the hour of the ox, around 2 in the morning, to begin their chanting and meditation. In Japan, the sound of the temple bell, deep, resonant, and unhurried, would roll over valleys and villages, marking the transition from night into the day's first sacred acts. This bell was more than a signal for the monks. It was a reminder to all who heard it of impermanence, mindfulness, and the ever-turning cycle of life. In Korean temples, the early hours often began with yabul, a formal ceremony of bowing, chanting, and offering incense. The air in the prayer hall would be heavy with the fragrance of burning wood and herbs, while outside, the mountain slopes lay hidden under a blanket of mist. Korean farmers and the work before sunrise in the rural provinces. Of Korea, farmers often worked in close harmony with the seasons. The hours before sunrise were precious, a time to prepare for long days in the fields. In planting season, families would gather in the half-light, offering small bowls of rice wine to household gods before stepping into the fields. Elders told younger workers that planting seeds before dawn brought better harvests, a belief rooted in both tradition and agricultural wisdom. During the hottest months, farmers might begin their labor under the stars to avoid the midday heat. The sound of hoes breaking the earth and water flowing into irrigation channels could be heard long before the village roosters began their morning chorus. The scholar's lamp while farmers and fishermen worked with their hands, scholars of V. The Confucian tradition in Korea often greeted the day with study. In the quiet of pre-dawn, they would light oil lamps and unroll scrolls of classic texts. For a scholar, the early morning hours were ideal. No marketplace noise, no family. Duties, only the silence in which the mind could absorb the teachings of the sages. Many believed that the mind was at its sharpest before the sun rose, and so they used this time for memorizing poetry, refining calligraphy, or meditating on moral principles. Festivals of first light. Both Japan and Korea had festivals tied to the moment of sunrise. In Japan, the first sunrise of the new year, Hatsuhi no Day, was and still is an important event. People would climb mountains, walk to beaches, or gather at shrines to watch the first light of the year break over the horizon. In Korea, certain harvest festivals began before dawn, with drumming and dancing that lasted until the sun rose, symbolizing the victory of light over darkness and the hope for abundance. The harmony of nature and discipline. In both Japan and Korea, the hours before dawn were a time of balance, where human discipline met the rhythms of nature. Whether in the strict training of a samurai, the patient waiting of a fisherman, the meditative calm of a monk, or the careful planting of a farmer, these cultures saw value in the stillness before the day. The darkness before sunrise was not wasted time. It was preparation for the body, for the mind, and for the spirit. In the next part, we'll take to the sea itself, exploring life before dawn on the open waters, from merchant ships to naval fleets, and the quiet rituals of sailors who measured time by stars instead of clocks. Far from the safety of land, the sea has always demanded its own kind of ritual. For those who live and work upon it, sailors, merchants, explorers, and fishermen, the hours before dawn were not simply another part of the day. They were a threshold. In that shifting time, when the stars still ruled the sky and the horizon was only a faint suggestion, the sea tested patience, skill, and faith. The watch and the dark on. Large sailing ships, the day was divided into watches, shifts of duty that rotated among the crew. The middle watch, from midnight to 4 in the morning, was one of the most difficult. It was a time when fatigue could creep in, when cold winds seemed sharper, and when the ship itself seemed to exist in its own lonely world. Those on watch before dawn were responsible for keeping the vessel on course, adjusting sails when winds changed, and maintaining a lookout for distant lights or the darker shadow of land. There was a strange intimacy in this work, the quiet conversation between crewmates, the slap of waves against the hull, the creak of rigging in the wind. When the first hint of gray appeared along the horizon, the watchmen often felt a quiet relief. The light meant not just the end of their shift, but the reassurance of another day survived. Stars as companions. Before modern navigation, the stars were both map and compass. Pre-dawn was often the most important time to take readings, as The sky was still dark enough for celestial bodies to be visible, but the horizon could already be faintly outlined. Navigators would emerge on deck with sextants in hand, finding familiar constellations like Orion, the Southern Cross, or the North Star. These stars told them not only where they were, but also how far they had yet to go. Sailors often spoke to the stars as if they were old friends. After all, in the endless sameness of the open ocean, these points of light were constants, unchanged, dependable, a reminder that the world still had order even in the middle of vast uncertainty. Prayers and superstitions life at sea carried, dangers so great that few sailors began their day, or their voyage, without some form of protection, be it prayer or superstition. In the hours before dawn, some would stand quietly at the ship's rail, murmuring a prayer to saints like Saint Nicholas or Our Lady, who were believed to guard seafarers. Others tied charms into the rigging, coins, feathers, or small carvings meant to ward off storms. Superstitions flourished in this darkness. Whistling on deck was avoided for fear of calling up the wind too fiercely. Certain knots were tied, in secret ways, thought to keep tempests away. A sudden cry in the pre-dawn hours was considered an omen, its meaning debated among the crew. The fishermen's rhythm for fishing vessels, the pre-dawn hours were often the most active. Nets and lines were prepared in silence, illuminated only by the glow of lanterns swinging gently with the movement of the waves. In some traditions, a small portion of the first catch was thrown back into the water as an offering to the sea, a gesture of respect to the forces that gave them their livelihood. The sea was not an enemy to be conquered, but a living partner, one that could bless or deny as it pleased. On whaling ships, before the light of day revealed the ocean's endless expanse, men would ready harpoons and scan the waters for a distant spray or movement. The stillness was deceptive. At any moment, the chase could begin. The smell of the galley in. The deep hours before sunrise, the ship's cook was often the first to stir below deck. The smell of coffee, hard bread warming over a stove, or salted meat being boiled drifted up through the hatches. Food on board was rarely luxurious, but in the cold dark before daybreak, even the simplest meal could feel like comfort. Sailors would gather in small groups, eating quietly, sharing stories, and looking out toward the black horizon where morning would soon break. Storms before morning. Not all pre-dawn hours at sea were peaceful. Some were marked by storms, sudden squalls that tested both ship and crew. In darkness, with rain whipping across the deck and waves crashing over the bow, the work became dangerous. In these moments, the pre-dawn was not a time of preparation, but of survival. Sailors shouted over the wind, hauling lines, reefing sails, and steering into the waves. Only when the first light appeared, revealing the shape of the clouds and the path of the swells, could they breathe easier. Moments of wonder. Yet for all its dangers, the pre-dawn sea could also be breathtaking. There were nights when the water shimmered with bioluminescence, the wake of the ship glowing like molten silver. Dolphins might leap alongside, their shapes visible only when they broke the surface and caught the faint light of the moon. As the horizon began to brighten, the world changed color by the minute, deep blues fading to violet, then to gold. The wind might shift, carrying the scent of land long before it was visible, and for a brief time everyone on board, whether captain or deckhand, might pause to watch the day being born over an endless expanse of water. In the next part, we'll step back onto solid ground to explore festivals of the first light, celebrations around the world that begin in darkness and reach their peak at sunrise. Around the world, there have always been celebrations tied to the arrival of the sun. Long before alarm clocks or electric lights, communities marked the transition from night to day with rituals, music, and gatherings. In many places, these events began not at sunrise, but in the deep hours before it, when anticipation was as much a part of the experience as the light itself. The gathering in the dark in remote villages, city squares, and open fields People would gather while the world was still cloaked in night. Fires were lit, casting flickering shadows on faces turned toward the east. Children huddled beside parents, rubbing sleep from their eyes while older generations spoke of the meaning behind the coming dawn. The air in these moments often carried a sense of unity. The darkness was shared. The coming light would be shared. 2. Japan's Hatsuhinode. In Japan, the tradition of Hatsuhinode, the first sunrise of the new year, draws thousands to beaches, mountaintops, and temples. People rise in the cold, sometimes traveling hours before dawn, to watch the first light of the year spill over the horizon. Before the sun appears, there is silence, broken only by the sound of waves or the rustle of winter wind. When the first ray pierces the sky, voices murmur blessings for health, prosperity, and happiness. Cameras click, but many simply stand still, letting the warmth of the light touch their faces as if receiving a gift. India's Chhath Puja. In parts of India and Nepal, Chhath Puja is a festival dedicated to the sun god, Surya, and his wife, Usha, the goddess of dawn. Devotees gather at rivers and ponds well before sunrise, standing waist-deep in water to offer prayers and fruits. The rituals begin in darkness, illuminated by oil lamps floating on the surface. Hymns echo across the water as the eastern sky slowly changes color. The moment the sun appears is greeted with folded hands and lowered heads, a gesture of gratitude for light, warmth, and life. Peru's Inti Raymi in the Andes, the ancient Inca festival Inti Raymi honored Inti, the sun god. Though today it is celebrated at the June solstice, in the Inca capital of Cusco, dawn was the central moment. Before the light returned, priests and nobles would keep vigil, fasting and praying. As the first rays broke over the mountains, golden cups of chicha, a ceremonial drink, were lifted in offering. The sun was not just a source of warmth. It was a divine ancestor, and greeting it properly ensured the balance of the world. Modern festivals with ancient roots, even in modern times, the connection between festivals and first light remains strong. New Year's Eve celebrations often stretch into the dawn, as if staying awake to greet the sun is a way to welcome the future. Music festivals, like those in deserts or coastal cliffs, sometimes plan their most moving performances for the moment the sun rises, a deliberate echo of ancient gatherings where song and rhythm guided people from night into day. Symbolism of first light across all these festivals, first light is more than just a physical change in the sky. It is a symbol of renewal, a reminder that every darkness ends and that each day is an opportunity to begin again. For those who rise early to participate, the effort itself is part of the ritual. In a world that moves quickly, pausing to wait for the sun, to witness the precise moment when night ends, is an act of devotion, whether religious or simply human. In the next part, we will look inward, exploring the psychology of the pre-dawn hours, why humans across history have found these moments so powerful and meaningful.